Hi, I'm Stirling Larkin from Australian Standfirst.
And I'm Christina Dean from Redress.
Christina, you're working in fashion and it's very topical with what's happening with the environment and the not-for-profit sector. Could you maybe explain a bit what you guys do and what you're seeing?
Sure. Well, Redress is an NGO working to reduce waste in the fashion industry that was set up 12 years ago. And over the last 12 years, we've seen radical change in both the fashion industry and its impact on the environment. And the sad and very sorry state of the current kind of global fashion industry is that it's exerted terrifically awful impact on the environment. I mean, some reports recently had fashion being the second biggest global polluter, which was more recently sort of refuted because the evidence didn't really stack up. But what we're seeing is it's one of the top global polluters. We're seeing its heavy reliance on the cotton industry, on oil, on farming, on metals and mining, and on forestry. And that's just looking at the environmental impact, not to even think about the social impact. And so it's very difficult to really find one conclusive statistic that really sums up all of these very different and very intensive industries. But more recently, where the industry is looking at the fact that the fashion and textile industry is contributing 10% of greenhouse gases, which is set to increase to 60% by 2030. So with a whole huge climate change debate and real sort of action at the moment, fashion industry has really come on the chopping board for that. We also see that the textile industry is contributing up to 20% of industrial water pollution, which has enormous health impacts around the whole world, and particularly in developing countries where a lot of these textiles are being produced. So fashion is on the chopping board and it deserves to be there for many of its enormous environmental impacts.
And you're based in Asia and you're obviously visiting us here in Australia. What's something, I guess, that's very topical that's happening in Asia that Australians can pay more attention to?
Well, we're based in Hong Kong, so we're on the doorstep to China, and that gives us a very unique sort of insight into Asia, because Hong Kong's within a 5-hour flight of half of the world's population. And the beauty of that really is that we're in an emerging market for consumption, which is quite honestly quite scary if you look at the statistics around fashion consumption in emerging markets. But we're also within the whole world's manufacturing hotspots. So in a way it's a double-edged sword, because we have huge growth in fashion retail and we have huge growth in fashion impact. And that impact is on the production side. So we're seeing a huge amount of waste on the supply chain being generated, and we're also seeing a huge amount of consumer waste being generated. And that's that consumer waste scenario that's now becoming much more visible to the whole world, not just in Hong Kong, China, rest of the world, but also in Australia.
Yes. I guess recycling is very topical here in Australia at the moment, and I assume would be in Asia as well. What role does recycling and individual consumption have to do with fashion and the things that you're seeing up in Asia?
Well, recycling is such an important industry across every sector to obviously reutilize waste materials. And the real problem that the fashion industry has, which is crippling both economically and also from an environmental perspective, is that there is not enough recycling technology to be able to deal with the types of waste materials that the fashion industry is generating. So, whereas in paper recycling, it's relatively straightforward. You're looking at a tree pulp, and paper is paper. I'm sure there's a variety of papers, but essentially you're looking at a similar fiber composition. But when you're looking at a textile, you're looking at a very complicated material, because you obviously have man-made or natural fiber, and even within synthetics you have very different kind of chemical compositions, which means that recycling clothing waste is very, 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 very difficult. Not just the fibers, but also all of the other embellishments and trims and zippers and buttons and all the things that go onto it. So we have a really bad situation where, despite the fact that the whole world knows that we need to find the solutions to recycle clothing waste and textile waste, no one's really doing it at scale. And the impact of that is that we're kind of getting completely drowned in clothing waste around the world. So the reason that we're getting drowned in clothing waste is not just because of the lack of scalable recycling, it's also because of the huge consumption. And the sad situation is that, consumers have gone on clothing overdrive. And over the last 15, 16 years, we've seen a double in clothing consumption. We're now consuming around 100 billion garments every single year, wow, which is 14 pieces per person, which is double from the year 2000. So number one, obviously we're buying way too many clothes and discarding them way too quickly. And within the last 15 years, we have also reduced the amount of time that we actually keep our clothes by 36%. So we're buying too much and we're not taking care of them, we're not even wearing them very much, and then we're getting rid of them. So we're stockpiling landfill, we're stockpiling charities, or rather not stockpiling, we're dumping on charities and we're dumping on landfill. And you can look at landfill data from different countries to see the steady increase in textile waste into the landfills, and particularly in the US, which is the world's biggest, they are the biggest global consumers per capita of textiles. If you look at their textile waste in landfill, what you will see is, this is a mass generalization, but over the last 15, 20 years, an increase in textile waste per percentage and a decrease in their solid municipal waste, which means that they're doing great on other types of waste reduction, but not on textile.
Clearly consumption is a part of that solution, but what else is possibly an answer to these problems?
Well, transforming the fashion industry is going to be enormously complex because the fashion industry in itself is it's a global, multifaceted industry. But the way that we can solve the problem is to move from a linear system into a circular system. So we know that the linear system for fashion is absolutely not working, where we take, we make, we use, and then we dispose. And that's why, of the 53 million tons of clothing that are produced every year, 73% is being incinerated or landfilled every year. So we know that we have to change that system. From an economic perspective, it's estimated that 100 billion USD is lost in value because of that linear system, because we're basically putting money in the landfill. So what we need to do is transition to that circular model, but that in itself is an enormously complex.
Could you maybe explain a bit more what the circular economy is? I mean, some people have heard that term, but everyone has a different view of what that means, and I guess in the context of fashion and the environment.
So the circular economy is really a system whereby apparent waste resources are reutilised back into the same industry or to other industries. And the very simplified way that I imagine this circular economy is just literally to imagine if a tree falls down, every part of that tree will biodegrade and give life to or nutrients to another sector. So that's how I think about the circular economy in the fashion industry. I think about all of the waste, whether it's in the manufacturing area or whether it's even in post-consumer. How do we utilise all of those materials back into the industry, or even to cross-industry? You can take waste from the fashion industry and use it in other sectors. For example, automobile.
I was going to say, are people doing that at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the automobile industry is taking cut and sew waste from manufacturers and recycling that into the hoods and the fabric and in cars and the seats, etc. So there is cross-collaboration to soak up waste in other sectors. Now, the beauty of this circular economy that everyone's chasing and everyone's excited about is that in theory, we could capture all of these lost resources and put them to use again. And the main obstacles for doing that at the moment are, number one, we don't have recycling technology. So in order to capture resources, you have to kind of change logistics systems, and you have to be able to capture waste where it's being, where it's piling up. And in the absence of decent technology on recycling, we are not able to actually capture resources and put them back to use.
I mean, that's very topical with regards to impact investing and social enterprise. What are you seeing in Asia with regards to that part of the economy? And is it something that Australians can learn from? And is there someone in the world who is leading in this space?
Yeah, I mean, well, what's interesting about the circular economy is it's not just all about recycling. I mean, the beauty of the recycling sector is it offers so much job opportunity for, different parts of the economy to come back into work, because it's sort of low-skilled work, so to speak, on the sort of operational side. But the kind of more business model developments around circular economy is based more on digital. So, we're seeing different ways of consuming clothes, such as clothing rentals, resales, hiring services or libraries. And the beauty of that is that we have technology that's able to support that. So, just even if you're looking at resale sites, they actually require some quite complicated tech on the kind of platform side. So the beauty of that is that we're able to allow consumers, generally younger ones, I'd say millennials, Gen Z, the opportunity to not even own fashion.
What does that mean?
It means that they're renting clothes. You can buy a subscription with a business and you can rent X per month, and then you just keep these clothes in circulation. Or even the resale market, what's interesting about that is that predictions are that the luxury resale market, so I'm talking about second-hand luxury clothes here, the luxury resale market is set to outpace the luxury market. And the some of the reasons for that, it's not all just about saving the world. The other reasons really are that the technology in AI has enabled these platforms to verify that what they're selling is true and not counterfeit goods, which has been one of the main obstacles around the luxury resale market. But the beauty of that is that certainly in Hong Kong, certainly in China and in Asia, where traditionally it was thought that consumers wouldn't want to wear second-hand, we are seeing that it's absolutely not true. And that with the right price point and the access to luxury, Chinese people are happy to buy second-hand.
And you're working in the social enterprise space yourself also in Hong Kong?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago I co-founded a social impact brand called the R Collective, which is an upcycle brand that upcycles luxury brands and manufacturers' waste in collaboration with emerging sustainable designers into an affordable luxury women's wear brand. And we have debuted with the likes of Lane Crawford and Barney's in New York. And the beauty of this business, it's another solution to the circular economy, because we're capturing waste materials from brands and manufacturers that would be on their way to incineration. And instead of allowing that to happen, we're designing them back into the fashion system so that we're elevating those materials and keeping them much higher in the value chain than allowing them to go into landfill. And as a consequence of that, ultimately what we're doing is slowing down the demand for virgin resources.
So for the not-for-profit sector here in Australia, these are very serious thematics. Again, what can Australians and the not-for-profit sector here learn from what you're seeing up in Asia and Europe?
Well, what we've directly experienced in Hong Kong is being swamped with post-consumer clothing waste. For the last 5 to 6 years, we've been collecting more and more and more. We're now almost drowning in it, actually, and it's becoming extremely expensive for a non-profit registered charity to deal basically with what is a lack of waste management that should be provided by a government. But we are stepping in as an NGO into that space. And so when I look at some of the Australian waste statistics, I would have some worries based on our learnings. I mean, you have the relatively recent entry of the fast fashion brands, the Zara's, the Topshop, the H&M's, etc., into the world here. And I think even in the last 5 years, you've seen a 20% increase in waste, post-consumer waste. And so in the absence locally here of larger recycling capabilities, what my concern is that you're going to be stockpiling post-consumer clothing waste. And at some stage, countries, owners have to make the decision of whether it's cheaper just to stuff it into landfill, or is it cheaper to ship it to another country.
Can not-for-profit sector here in Australia or elsewhere have a bigger part in that solution?
Well, the charitable sector has historically been very instrumental in dealing with clothing waste, and they've done that for humanitarian and fundraising activities. But the problem is now that charities are being swamped with way too much that they could possibly deal with. I was reading that in Australia, charities here are spending $13 million on just dealing with the clothes that they don't actually want. And it seems to me that charities are being treated like garbage bins, receiving a lot of trash, basically. And what that does is it diverts their resources and their efforts from their primary mission to basically dealing with rubbish.
So I guess the question is, what can individual people do?
Well, I think individual people should consider themselves to be fashion citizens and not consumers. I mean, the Latin for consumers to destroy through use. And I think as global citizens, we should be much more active in how we partake in fashion. I think we should walk away from being consumers and instead see fashion as a vehicle for something much more meaningful. It is very possible to have an ethical closet and still have different clothes and still feel good about fashion without having to tear through clothes, mass clothing consumption. So what that practically means on a sort of more day-to-day level is to buy fewer clothes and to wear the clothes that you have for much longer. If we can extend the clothing's use phase for as long as possible, and I'm not suggesting that we walk around in rags, but I am suggesting that we take better care and wear them more, that is how we will see direct impacts, positive impacts on the environment. And ultimately, it is a very important question that people need to look themselves in the mirror and say, do I need to buy so many clothes? And hopefully the answer will be an honest no.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.